Welcome to Lucid Work series, Connected Experiences with me, Jess Jurva, Chief Customer Officer. Our episodes explore the human side of connected experiences, what having a connected experience means, and how to build more connected experiences with the world around us. Today, I'm joined by Katie Flores, Senior Manager, PR Marketing, and Jenny Gomez, Director, Product Marketing at Lucid Works. Welcome. Our session today, you're welcome. Our session today will explore themes under the umbrella of Hispanic Heritage Month. Specifically, our topics will cover connected experiences with identity, allyship, and the Latina Hispanic Equal Pay Day, which is coming up on October 21st. So let's jump right into this. Jenny or Katie, I'd like to ask both of you how you would describe yourself.
Sure, I can go first. I'll take a swing at it. So I'm Katie Flores. I'm super excited to be a part of this Connected Experience series with you, Jess. I've been at Lucid Works in-house for almost 3 years now. I live in San Francisco on Ohlone lands. I've been here for a little over a decade. I'm also a professional dancer outside of my communications work with Lucid Works, and I'd say that's a really big piece of my identity that doesn't live on LinkedIn, but is big in my heart.
Awesome. What would you say, Jenny? How would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I mean, well, from the professional side, product marketing director here at Lucid Works. I've been here a year. I think my anniversary is coming up like next week. So yeah, no, I like Katie, have a former life in the performing arts and was an actor and a producer and a playwright for about 15 years and sort of transitioned into marketing kind of in the middle of it. And I consider myself a storyteller because of it. I was a storyteller when I was on stage, and I'm a storyteller in my day-to-day today. So that's like one of the major reasons why I love marketing. But I live here in Durham, North Carolina by way of New York City. It's been super interesting living in the South in a nice little bubble in the North Carolina triangle. And I identify, I'm first generation American. My parents are immigrants from Cuba. I identify as Hispanic because Caribbeans don't technically fall into the Latina bucket or the Latinx bucket. That's usually like Central and South America. So Caribbeans are usually in the Hispanic bucket. So that's what I identify as. But yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. Let me ask you both this. When I first reached out to you about this whole series and talked to you about connected experiences, what first came to your mind when you heard the term connected experiences? Obviously, we use that in our branding, but from the human side, what came to mind?
Katie? I think my gut goes to creating, and I'm trying to take off my marketing hat here, but creating true connection between people. I think as dance kind of being my like almost default language, how we connect on a very personal level and physically when we're around each other, which unfortunately is rare right now. That's the first thing that my mind goes to. And then immediately after, I think about connections that I have with people that are really strong. So I think on a first take, it's all people related stuff.
Yeah. And Jenny, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I harken back. We just recently had our marketing MKO a couple weeks ago, and we did a value exercise. I think it was based on Brene Brown's sort of leadership principles. And I think one of the things I chose was love as one of my values, which sounds super corny, but I think love is sort of it just encompasses like having respect for people, and like leading with love, I think is being open to what other people's experiences are, and respecting who they are as individuals, regardless of what that might be. And I think that's connection, is being able to see people and to have an open mind to see people for who they are, even if it's something that might oppose, your own personal beliefs. So
yeah.
So, and connection to me also just I think you can learn a lot about people if you have that open mind, especially against opposing views or opinions.
So true.
And I think that creates real connection.
Yeah. So Jenny, you spoke about this a little bit when you were describing your own identity, but when you think about connecting with who you are and what you do. And, you mentioned you don't connect really with the term Hispanic. How has that shaped sort of your workplace views, or sort of how you experience your workplace?
Yeah. We had spoken about that before when we were chatting about this panel, is that, yeah, it's not, Hispanic isn't the first thing that I identify with at all. And I think it's because my first generation experience, and a lot of the first generation experiences of like Latinos that came at a certain time into the United States, we were sort of, my parents were asked to assimilate, and they wanted to assimilate because they wanted to be part of that American story. They wanted that American dream, like so many people and so many immigrants that come to this country looking for something different for a million different reasons. Some easy, some very hard. And so I just always sort of, identified as American. And as I've gotten older and have been in the workplace a lot longer, and I'm a little bit more mature in my career, I realize it's so important to sort of to create a certain amount and to identify with your group, because it elevates the other people around you. I think so many younger sort of Hispanic and Latinx people and women, are a lot more, and I'm so excited about it, are just a lot more disciplined and like super into saying, no, I'm Latina, I'm Hispanic, like this is who I am, like love it or leave it. And I love that attitude, and it wasn't necessarily the attitude that I was raised with. So so I'm learning from a younger generation, but then also trying to show up and say, hey, like I'm somebody that needs to be a leader in my community, even if it's something that feels a little uncomfortable for me based on my history. So like it's up to me to step up to the plate and create that example for other sort of Latinas and Hispanic people, coming into the workforce and wanting to develop a career, let's say in tech, for instance, or storytelling or marketing.
Yeah. And how about you, Katie? Is Hispanic a term that you connect with in terms of your own identity?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I feel like when you first approached Jenny and I, one that I've been grappling with, I think, which sounds like an intense word, but I think it is kind of an intense, challenging thing to figure out. And I relate to a lot of what Jenny's saying. So I would identify as white and Latina. My grandfather immigrated here when he was in his early 20s from Colombia. And my other three grandparents are all first generation, European and Eastern European, but my great grandparents were all immigrants. And so it's interesting to think of the fact that like by blood, I'm 25% Colombian. And then how do you apply that to like the lived experiences that you've had? Because I think of my grandfather, who unfortunately is no longer with us. And I know that he would see me as a full-blown Latina, but I feel self-conscious and acknowledge the fact that I have a lot of privilege as a white person, as a white passing Latina, that a lot of people are not afforded. And so it's really been a journey, and I even feel nervous talking about it because it's a big discussion with so much nuance about how you identify and take up space or don't create space, don't take up space, or you create space for others and you kind of like buoy them up. And I think about the fact that, when my grandfather came here and had kids, my dad and his four siblings didn't learn how to speak Spanish because it wasn't it was something that my grandfather had been discriminated against for and experienced some unfortunate realities about being an immigrant and someone who has a thick accent and darker skin until the day he died. And so my father didn't learn to speak Spanish. And so I think about other friends that I have who are 100% blood, Hispanic or Latina, who don't speak Spanish for the same reasons. And they feel some type of challenge or judgment or not being legitimate enough in certain circles because they've lost that part of their identity. And how do you factor all of that in? I feel like I'm answering your question with more questions, but it's a really challenging thing. And I think, where I've landed right now is that I do identify as white. I have Polish and Croatian grandparents. On the other side, I have my Colombian grandfather and my Sicilian grandma. But I also identify as Latina because I think there's a big part of me that grew up with those traditions and huge extended family members. And it feels like an important part of my history. That being said, I'm at this place now where I feel like, similar to what Jenny said, trying to figure out my responsibility to live between both of these spaces, where how can I support other Latin, Hispanic women and Latinx male identifying people, to make sure that their voices are heard in the workplace and in other places. So, but also not taking up space from them. So it's a lot of nuance, which I love that you're giving us the opportunity to kind of take the time to break all of that down, because it's not a clear answer for everyone.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate what you're saying around sort of what is our responsibility when you have a mixture in your background, and there's not one clear sort of, hey, this is how I identify. How then do you bring other people forward and create sort of an allyship there? So let's talk a little bit about allyship. You know, how do you view ways that you specifically can help, whether it's in the workplace or even outside in your personal things that you do or hobbies? Like, how do you bring those people forward? How do you become an ally? Are there any experiences that you can share or examples of like how to do that?
I mean, I can sort of jump in a bit, and I identify with virtually everything Katie said because it is complex. I think one of the big things you can do is start having these conversations. You know, I think the nuance of intersectionality, even within the Latin and Hispanic communities, is vast. And to start to just unpack it a little bit and explain and like talk about it and have like live conversations about it is so important, because you're educating a community. And then you're also creating a moment in time where, like, you know, Katie and I sort of, you know, saying that like, yeah, I identify as white as well, just like Katie does. You know, but I'm first generation and 100% blood. But it does, you know, but I would bring, you know, I would still say Katie's a Latina, and you know, we share that. And so I don't, you know, I'm never going to be like, oh, you're only 25%. Excuse
totally,
me. Like,
totally. But it's a weird, like, you know, self-imposed. I don't know. Yeah. But
it makes sense. Yeah.
Totally.
Like, it's just, and it's interesting to hear from your perspective that like you have like a little bit of sort of uncomfortableness and insecurity about being like, I don't really feel like I should identify with this, but like, girl, come join the party. Like, you're welcome here. Like, so, and it's, and I think it's just creating that dialogue, I think, is so important. And then also doing your due diligence, right? Like Katie, I have white privilege and white passing privilege, which is huge. And like, it would, as uncomfortable as it is to admit, it would be wrong of me for the other women in my community or people in my community that don't have that privilege for me not to identify it. And to also understand, like, I understand that there's immigrants for, you know, there's bias that starts to happen if, for instance, you're just an immigrant and not first generation, or if you're second generation versus first generation. And it's identifying what those biases are and understand like the pressure and like the different situations that people that have to grapple with the biases bring with them. For instance, like in an interview, like if I interview somebody who is like 100%, whose parents are immigrants, don't speak English, maybe like nobody in their family went to college. Like I just had a mentee that I was helping with, teaching her about just like financial like health and wealth. Like she didn't know how to open a credit card because like her parents couldn't teach her how to do that stuff because they were immigrants, and like she was the first person to go to college. She's dark-skinned Ecuadorian, and even her dark skin was a point of like contention for her because she experienced a lot more bias than, let's say, a Latina or a Hispanic person that's white passing. So it's so important for us in the community to understand all those nuances and like and empower the people that are experiencing perhaps more bias, because they just need more help. And so like taking my time, I try to take my time and my privilege and say, okay, I deserve to give my time. Not don't deserve, they deserve. The people that experience more bias deserve more of my time because they need more support. And I think that's an uncomfortable thought to say, that like people that experience bias need more help or more support. Not help. Help sounds like it's being like savory, but support and like attention. and like recognizing those biases is essential.
Yeah. And I that brought to mind one example that happened recently. I was in a performance. It was like a concert, and this woman Isque is Cree, and she had incorporated a lot of indigenous music and drumming and some dancing. And I remember I was in the cast of the dancers, and she was teaching us this one step. And there was a moment where all of us had this feeling of like, none of us are indigenous. And so we had this feeling of like, are we allowed to be doing this step? And it turned into this huge, great conversation with her about, you know, what it's like when you go to a powwow and you're dancing, and what community dances are like. And community dances are for everyone, including non-indigenous people. But there also are dances that are not for you if you're not indigenous. And I remember really vividly what she said after we had that conversation was like, if anything else comes up over the course of this time, ask me. Even if you think it's maybe offensive, I'll let you know if it's offensive. But if you feel so stunted that you can't even ask anything, then you're definitely not going to learn about what I'm bringing to the table. So, and that's a fine line, right? Where like, you don't want to be offloading the work of explaining onto someone else. But in that moment when she offered, it felt like a nice door was open. So as we talk about like the nuance of all of these things and feeling legitimate enough, or like, I feel weird that I can speak Spanish, but my dad can't, but my grandpa did. And then even, I know we talked about this a couple weeks ago, where it's like, yes, my grandpa is Colombian, but if you want to go back hundreds of years, we have roots in Spain. So then you have this whole other component of like, I don't know, my family lineage is not is not beautiful when you go back hundreds of years and consider what history has done to Latin America. So the nuance is crazy, and the conversation is really important.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with you on that. And I think both of you have mentioned like it's important to have these conversations. I feel like I don't want to say that we are an evolved society, but we have at least evolved conversation, right? To be able to talk about, hey, you shouldn't name a sports team after a tribe or after a group of people, you know, having conversations like that, you know, statues that are being taken down because of what they represent, like those are all great advancements. But we're getting there because we're having these conversations. Whereas I think before, no one would really talk about it, right? Except for within your own communities.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit then about, you know, we've talked about allyship and sort of what each of you can do. And actually one quick point I want to ask you about, Jenny, is that, you know, we're talking about biases. One of the things you had mentioned a couple of weeks ago in our prep session was around when you first meet someone, right? And they don't know your full name. And they only know you as Jenny, but then when you introduce yourself, you can see sort of things change. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I remember when I was doing theater and doing commercial work, I auditioned for all kinds of stuff, and I auditioned for a lot of stuff in Miami and bilingual work. So I would do work in English, and I would also do work in Spanish. And I remember and this is just like this odd Hollywood idiosyncrasy where you can absolutely put like what races and genders and like, you know, others things that you want like in a casting brief. So it's a funny circumstance, and I'm excited to see how that evolves into something more dynamic in the future. But I would get bucketed a lot. My agent would send me out specifically for things in the Latin community for Spanish speaking things when they wanted someone that was ethnically ambiguous. So like I could look like a lot of different kinds of Hispanic or Latina people, or not at all if that was needed too. Like if they wanted somebody that looks like they could identify maybe with the Latina community or Hispanic community, like I would get sent on that stuff because I didn't, and I would get from casting directors like, oh, you don't look Puerto Rican enough, or you don't look you know, XX enough, or like, yeah, all the time. And it happens to me in casual conversation. Like people will meet me and be like, what? Oh, I mean, this happens so often it's exhausting. Like, what's your
Mm.
nationality? What's
Yeah.
your ethnicity? Like, no. And I'm like, I'm American. And then I always get the second question, which is, no, but like your background, like where are your parents from? And I was like, first of all, not your goddamn business, pardon my language.
Yeah.
Not your business, but that's like a constant in my life. And
Yeah.
sometimes I mess with people and I just say like Greek or Italian or Jewish or whatever, you know. But then when I say I'm Latina or Hispanic, like there's like an immediate shift.
Yeah.
Like you can feel it in some people. And like the bias just like kicks in automatically.
Yeah.
And like you notice it, like you notice that like body change or like, you know, the head cocks or something like that. And it's something that, you know, we have to grapple with as humans, and certainly in this piece of the intersection.
Sure. Yeah.
But
Katie, has that ever happened to you? Have you experienced something similar when people see you and get introduced to you, and you know, learn about your last name?
I feel like I have a similarly white first name, Katie, as Jenny. And I only say that because Jenny told us that her parents wanted her to be named something that wasn't immediately identifiable as, you know, as something Latin or Hispanic. You know, it's funny. I think that some people are surprised that I feel like it almost goes the other way, where people assume that I'm white or Italian. I feel like if you have dark hair, I don't know, there's a lot. And I am, again, another quarter thing that I am. But I think that for the most part, I haven't noticed any huge changes or shifts. I think there's something interesting happening in dance right now, specifically, where a lot of organizations are finally making the effort to expand who's performing and who's directing and who's choreographing beyond, you know, white performers, or more specifically, especially in dance, white men. And so I feel like I've been reached out to a lot more for different opportunities because of my last name, which is also interesting because I feel like I shared before, I feel complex about it. There's so many different like layers of that. So then if you just have a last name that sounds Latin, how does that influence you, or how does that feel? And I remember even when I got married 2 years ago, my husband is Belgian and his last name is super long with like 10,000 vowels in it. And I'm so connected to my identity of my last name that I kept it. So it's this, I always have this question of like, people are putting me in a bucket because of how my last name is spelled. And it has a Z instead of an S, which is like also blows people's minds. So I don't know, it's something I'm conscious of, how people can identify you just based on your name, but there's so much other things and information and histories that go into that.
Yeah. And Katie, that's funny you mentioned, I'm sorry, Jess, but it's funny you mentioned the thing about the last name, is because in my professional life, I kept my maiden name, which is Gomez. But when I got married, I changed my name to Almonte, which is my husband's last name, but which is my husband's last name. And I liked it because it was a prettier Spanish name, strictly it was just vanity. It was like, it's the only reason why I changed it. I just liked it better than Gomez, like 100, like. But what's crazy is he's half Filipino. So his Spanish last name comes because the Spanish conquistadors went to Asia, unfortunately.
Yeah, totally.
Which is wild. So it's like, I still have a like Latin last name, but it's Filipino technically. And it's prettier than Gomez. But that's like the last name is a whole thing too, you know?
Yeah. And even kind of keeping on that topic, you know, when we interviewed Jeanette Melgarejo just a couple of weeks ago, she was talking about hiring practices. And so when people submit their resumes and you know, their name is viewed, there's bias that goes into, even though you might have a conversation with that person, you might have them do more work to work for that interview a little bit harder than you would someone who has a white name, right? Or some sort of European name, right? Which sounds more intriguing. But if it's a person of color or someone who has a, you know, Latinx last name or Latin name, there's like a bias that goes into that even in the interviewing process. So which is very fascinating, you know, when you look at people's last name and the thoughts that come into people's minds around that. So let's shift a little bit to talking more about sort of the workplace and sort of how things are perceived. So, you know, it is the Hispanic Equal Pay Day coming up. And so on October 21st, I'd love to get both of your thoughts on how you see that showing up in the workplace and why it's important for us to even have a day that highlights and creates awareness around that. Jen,
yeah, sure. So yeah, I find it interesting that Latina and Hispanic Equal Pay Day is October 21st. It's the latest of all of the sort of like intersectionalities of women of color. Actually, I don't know, because they only do the three. They do white, Black, and Hispanic, Latino. I'd be curious to see. Oh, and I believe they also do Asian, but I'd be curious to see what it would also be for Indigenous. Would probably, my assumption, unfortunately, would probably land closer to the Latina and Hispanic Equal Pay Day. But it's an interesting thought that Hispanic and Latina is later, because there's I mean, it's a little controversial because it's like, why? Like, you have to ask yourself, like, why is it so much later than everybody else's? And it goes back to the question of like all the nuance of being Hispanic and Latina, I think, is that culturally a lot of, you know, there's still a lot of machismo in the culture of, you know, in Hispanic and Latin cultures. So like a lot of women still like do servicey type kind of jobs, still stay home with the kids. Obviously a lot of that is changing now, but like, and then I think there's also the immigrant piece too, where there's a lot of bias and sort of like lack of privilege if you're straight up an immigrant and not first generation, and then it trickles, right? Like first generation gets a little bit more, like I mentioned before. So I bring it up because it's always some food for thought when you're thinking about intersectionality, and the nuance behind intersectionality. Because I don't want to speak too much to like the Black female experience, because it's certainly not my own and it's not my place, but with all this systemic racism in America, you like, it's just something to, it's like, it's a thought exercise.
Yeah.
Why the dates are what they are.
Yeah. And Jenny, you had brought up not too long ago just about an initiative that Google did, and you cited some stats, and it was really interesting. I'd love for you to talk about that if you can.
Yeah, sure. I think, let me pull them up really quick. Because I had them written down. Yeah, so I was curious because the tech industry as a whole likes to sort of tout so much investment. Like, we're doing so much about diversity and inclusion, and we have a new head of diversity and inclusion, and we have all these programs in place. But I wanted to see what the numbers actually said. Sure. And so it was back in 2014 that Google made that big announcement that they were going to put like all of this money into their diversity and inclusion programs. And they cited, let me find. So they looked at the demographic data across their company, and they found that 83% of the company was men, 60% was white, 30% was Asian, just 2.9% were Latino, and 1.9% was Black. This was in 2014 when Google did like their big sort of like, let's see if we're actually diverse, and obviously clearly found that they were not. So they have put, after that 2014 date, they invested $150 million in diversity and inclusion at Google. And then they ran the numbers again in June of 2020. And they found that the numbers had gone up, that only 5.9% of their employees were now Latino versus the 2.9%. So like a 3-ish percent difference. And then 3.7% were Black versus the 1.9% back in 2014. $150 million. Yeah, and they were only able to move the needle that much. So, and then if you benchmark, I decided to look at census data against those numbers to see what the demographic data across Silicon Valley was. And and I just looked at the Latino population. So again, Google employees, and I think this was only US that they ran these numbers. So across the US, and then I went down to Silicon Valley, and 25% of the population in Silicon Valley is Latino. A quarter of the population in Silicon Valley is Latino, and 5% of the employees at Google are Latino. To give you a general idea of what bias looks like in data. And after $150 million, what did they do with that money? What did they do with that money?
Something seems wrong.
Anyway,
something seems wrong. Yeah. And so, Katie, for you, how does that show up in dance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think a little bit too about privilege is a piece of it. When in Jenny's example of like something like advocating for your salary or advocating for pay, not everyone was brought up like knowing how to do that, or
Right.
I mean, it's a skill set. It's also like a personality thing. It's a confidence level. It's about being in the right company who will actually sit down and listen to you advocate for yourself. But in dance, it's interesting because really over the past year and a half, 2 years, it's really taken off, where there are, and I'm thinking of one in particular, it's in New York, it's called the Dance Artists National Collective. They go by DANC for short, DANC. And they're creating all of these advocacy platforms and templates for how you review and negotiate contracts. How you talk about pay and salary, because when you look at it from a dance perspective, like, you know, we take for granted that our paycheck happens in our account every 2 weeks, but that's not a thing with dance. There's been many projects where you know, they say they're going to pay you, and then it's months later and it's like, well, shit, I didn't sign the contract. And how do you advocate for yourself without, you know, blacklisting yourself from ever being hired again? It's wild how different it is from corporate life advocating for pay. Because when I step into my job at LucidWorks, as much as I love you guys, like, if I'm not getting paid, I'm not working at all. And I'm going to make a big deal about the fact that I'm not getting paid. So it's been cool coming from a place where I had the privilege growing up to be, to learn enough about how business works, to feel confident advocating for myself in a situation like a corporate company, technology company like LucidWorks, and taking that knowledge and sharing that with colleagues in the dance field who maybe don't know how to negotiate their salary or their contracts, or when something doesn't go according to contract, when you're asked to do something on set that you never signed up for, how do you navigate that? So I feel like there's a lot of, it's a spectrum of education of how you advocate for yourself. And, you know, corporate world is very different from what's happening in the arts. So I think that bringing those two things together and being a bridge in some ways for people has been really important. And I think also one of the things I've been, you know, just reflecting on a lot before we are all, you know, on the phone today was about being a woman in a space that is, you know, very male dominated. Marketing is kind of a weird beast, because in my experience with different companies and startups, marketing, again, personal experience, has always been a lot of women or female identifying people. So it's interesting when you get into these positions where it's like, well, my little team is, I feel safe and comfortable and seen, but the larger organization, there's been plenty of times where I feel like I've been talked over in a meeting or ignored or not invited to something that I should have been a part of. And I think that's just an effort of practice for personal, you know, abilities to speak up for yourself, but then also like gassing up the people that are around you. You know, when you get on a call and you're one of the women on your team shares some great success that they've had, write them a message and say, that's incredible. Make sure you write that down. Make sure you list that when you ask for your next promotion. Like, all of that stuff is so important. And if we're not taking the time to build each other up, I think so much is lost.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. I think tech especially, there are certain roles where you see primarily women, you know, from legal to HR to customer success to marketing, you know, like where it's more caretaking type roles, if you want to look at it in that way. Where you see less of that is sales, executive management, boardrooms, you know, those areas where women want to be and should be, but yet are held back from that. So there's a lot of work yet to do there in terms of even, pushing women into those places.
Totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll say this is like a holdover from the pink collar jobs of your,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So since we're talking about money, let's talk about how we spend it. So how does connection to your identity influence how you spend? Where do you shop? What brands resonate with you? Jenny, I would love to hear some of your stories.
Yeah. I think I have to sort of commend our fellow brothers and sisters. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw a huge shift in we saw a huge cultural movement sort of happening before our eyes, or the continuation of a cultural movement with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think it radicalized. I don't know how I know that it radicalized a lot of people in a lot of different ways. And we can talk about, I mean, that could be a whole different conversation, but I know that it made me a lot more in tune to where I put my dollars. And I think a huge part of elevating a community and elevating a group of people is to spend your money with that group of people. And so it made me think about, just as a Latina, even in my own intersectionality, and obviously supporting Black-owned businesses as well, and small businesses, I think is also important, right? Because you're creating generational wealth in a community. But like one thing that I did that happened was that I found small Brown-owned businesses, and one of them was this amazing spice company called Luisa that's based out of the Bronx, and I think they're Dominican. I want to say it's a Dominican, two Dominican family members that like made their own spices like in their basement or backyard in the Bronx, and started like touting them as an alternative to other sort of maybe big corporations like Goya. And so I went, and I like threw out a lot of my like other products and decided to focus on small Brown-owned businesses to create generational wealth in those communities. And I think it's so important. Again, it's just about being like present to make those choices. Like it takes a little bit of extra work, but if we're not doing that little bit of extra work, like we're not, we're contributing to the problem and not the solution.
Yeah. And I love the term of radicalizing your wallet. I think that's brilliant. Katie, have you seen any influences in the way that you spend now in terms of the connection to your own identity and community?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I had been conscious of, I'll say something I've been conscious of and something that I've, become awakened to. I do buy from a lot of small businesses already in San Francisco. They're all over the place. I think one of the things that I wasn't conscious of was going through that thought process of like, who owns this business, and realizing that a lot of the places that I bought from are women owned, which is great. But then also realizing that you see some people like, where can I buy from a women owned shop? And it's like, how do you not know? Like, what about all these amazing stores? So it was like fun to do a little more research and where I'm buying stuff from. And I think one of the cool things that I've enjoyed in San Francisco, having been here for a while, is getting to know different families that own small. I'm thinking of one health food market that we lived above, me and my husband, for like 5 years. The family was super wonderful. And just, again, creating connections, going back to how we started this whole conversation about knowing where your money is going when you spend it, and being really conscious about that. And again, talking about privilege, being in a privileged enough place that, Jenny has the dollars to get spices that she wants shipped to her house, which is awesome. And if we can do that, we absolutely should. Yeah.
All right. So technology has shifted and changed in a lot of ways and has made it easier for small businesses to get started. When you think about Square and how easy it is now to transact versus like, people having to deal with just cash alone. How in digital wallets on the phones, how do you guys view in the Latinx community, how has technology shifted or changed? Do you feel like it's inclusionary? Do you feel like it excludes? What is your viewpoint on that?
there's a few, again, nuance. There's a few things where like, it's also knowing, I worked in advertising tech and media tech before I came to LucidWorks to work in search. And I mean, in any sort of like tech space or space where you're thinking about the data and you're thinking about who your audience is, like, I found it really funny that like Hispanics and Latinos, like as in general, as a population, tend to do a lot more on their mobile devices. Like even watch content and watch TV and things like that. So if you're trying to reach them for advertising, you like all of your dollars should go, and mostly all your dollars should go into mobile. And which is an interesting thing to unpack in and of itself. But then also it's about access too. If you're thinking about immigrant communities, they tend to be lower income, so they might not have access to the same kinds of things, access to maybe really nice smartphones, or access to even like Wi-Fi and connectivity, you know, and you think about what that does to maybe like degrade opportunities for, you know, for some immigrants or some lower income people of color in different communities. Like, what does it mean for the kids going to school if they don't have access to a laptop or an iPad, like things like that. So while, but then, you know, you bring up the small business thing, like the spices that I bought, like I bought them from New York and got them delivered to my door during a pandemic, and was able to put money into that small business's wallet because of Shopify or probably something like it. And I wouldn't have been able to do that. Like I wouldn't have been able to go to New York just to buy spices. Like, you know, so it goes both ways, right? You need to make sure that everyone does get access, and then that access can help open up opportunity for everybody. Yeah. Whether it's education or commerce or whatever. So I don't know. Yeah. My 2 cents, scattered as they were.
Katie, what's your view on this?
I think about it, I'll take it more into like maybe a workplace context. I think that one of the things that has become clear now that we don't have, you know, the in-person relationships as much anymore. Like Jenny and I have been working together for a year, and I physically met her and hugged her in person for the first time like 2 weeks ago. I think that where technology can connect us, there's also the kind of other side of the coin where we have to be even more conscious of the signals, the body language, how we talk with each other, how we message each other. Even we have to be more conscious of that maybe than we even were before, because I'm sure people in corporate workplaces can relate to this, where, you know, maybe you get a short message from your boss, but you have a personal relationship with them, and you know, like, I'm not going to read into that too much because I know that's just how they talk on Slack, but they're actually okay in person. That doesn't happen now that we're all on digital channels. So I think technology has provided a lot of connection, but it also created a lot of conversations that I hope will be ongoing around how we address people in a digital space, because those lessons are endless.
Yeah. And that you actually bring up a really valid point, which is that, you know, because we are now talking more over Zooms and Google Meets and things like that, the biases that have existed before can even represent themselves, I think at a greater degree, right? Is someone paying attention to me? Are they talking over me more than they normally would be? And they're not getting the cues because maybe they're not looking at everyone else, right? They're looking at themselves in the camera. And so I think it's, you brought up a great point around being very much more aware of like, hey, I have to be even more heightened in terms of how I'm working with folks now that it's more over camera versus in person. So it's a great point.
Yeah. I know. I read some interesting data too, and it's oh, I'm so sorry, but yeah, no, just you just brought it up. It was a female thing where it's like I don't know who crunched the data, like Vox Media or something, but it was like women are still expected to like dress nicer and wear makeup on stuff on camera. And it's like creating like extra pressure for women, and like that small little thing. And it's so true. In the beginning of the pandemic, I was like, oh my God. And now forget it. But
I know I'm the same way. I'm like,
but it's like, you know,
what
it's
is
extra
that?
labor.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah. But what I find very, I agree with you. I kind of put that expectation on myself as well at the beginning. And now it's like, hey, I might just be coming in from a run or from working out. So like, kind of quickly do my hair and then like put a jacket on to make sure that it looks good enough, like to be on camera. But yeah, I think the expectation is still there, whereas men can wear like baseball
Totally.
caps and no one thinks anything different. Yeah.
Totally. I feel like also being in a technology company is interesting too, because depending on where you're sitting, back when we sat in the office, depending on where you're sitting, the clothing is very different. The sales team is going to look one way. The developers are going to look another way.
Yep.
Marketing is going to look one way. And I feel like as a woman in the workplace, having worked with leaders several rungs above me, men who wear like hoodies and stuff to work,
Right.
anytime I'm in a hoodie on a Zoom call, I'm not feeling bad about it, because I know that I've been 5 minutes before I was on the call with the CEO and he had a hoodie on. So I don't know. I think that I hope that grace continues as we move forward, that it literally doesn't matter what's on my body if the quality of work that I'm doing is
correct.
Is great.
Yeah. And even having different interruptions, right? Which is that a lot of times when women, this happens like several times a week, right? Where a lot of the women that we work with, their kids are coming in to ask a question. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they need to know how to turn the TV on. Like, that's okay, and I'm glad that we actually get to see more of that personal side, and to know what people are going through, right? During this time. So my last question for you both is, where do you see this going in terms of, the connection with your own identity and sort of opportunities that you see exist to connect more? Like, where do you see this going?
That's a big question.
I think we need to, go ahead, Katie.
No, I was just going to pontificate on how that was a big question. But I'll say that I think conversations like this is the first time I've personally had a conversation like this in the workplace. And I think the opportunity to create more connection and to be better allies and to better support our own communities is more. In a lot of ways, I think as I'm sharing my story, I'm thinking of all the stories that aren't being shared and wanting to create additional space for those people. And I think the other big thing, along with connection, is empathy for one another, and creating spaces digitally where we can feel safe and also able to share our histories.
Yeah. And I love what you said, Katie, because as I've even been thinking about this series, it's like, ultimately, what do I want to get out of this? I want to tell people's stories. I want other people's stories to be heard, to amplify those stories. And that ties into what you said, Jenny, right? Like your whole a career has been about storytelling. So this series hopefully allows for that as well. But Jenny, would love to hear your viewpoint on where you see this going.
Well, yeah, I just mirror exactly what you guys said about what you lovely humans said about giving the space to stories. I think so much bias comes from ignorance. And ignorance just comes from lack of access to stories like these. Like, if we don't know what human beings are going through, and I think sometimes when things get tense, especially sometimes when there's polarization of opinions, a lot of it is just because, and I think we forget that humans have a vast capacity for empathy once we're actually faced with a moment to have empathy. But if we're ignorant to why people are feeling the way that they're feeling, because they just don't know what those people are going through, then it's then you can kind of understand why those moments of empathy were lost. And that's why these stories are so important, because it helps you sort of really expand your capacity to sort of feel for other people. And I think that's what and that's connection, right? That's love and respect.
Yep.
And that's why, so more stories.
Yeah. And I'll make one small plug too for people who are interested in hearing more stories specifically around being Latinx and Hispanic. Code Switch, which is an awesome podcast through NPR, has a lot of really great episodes where they interview people who have all kinds of different backgrounds about what it means to be Hispanic versus Latinx versus, light skin versus indigenous. And you hear like the nuance of all these conversations, and it makes you think about identity that maybe you haven't before in a way you haven't before. So just a plug.
Yeah, love to check that out. Well, thank you both. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and appreciate both of you participating in this, and hope to have you on the show again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jess.
Jess.
Thank you.